I'm Sarah Atkinson and I'm a primary English and literacy consultant working in LPDS. I'm here today to talk to you about the assessment of reading. Now, let's be honest, sometimes the thought of assessing reading can be quite a daunting one. Indeed, in terms of an evidence base, it somehow feels a lot less tangible, doesn't it, than, say, for example, writing. So today I'm going to take you through a few considerations, a few practical things that you may already have going on in your classroom that will hopefully reassure you and help to inform that accurate reading assessment. I'd like to start with the simple view of reading. Many of you may have seen this numerous times before. I know we reference it an awful lot on our English training. And indeed, it was referenced in the reading framework published in July 21. What it does is it acknowledges that reading essentially is made up of two components, two dimensions: word recognition skills, as measured here on the x-axis, and language comprehension, as measured on the y-axis. Now, ideally, we'd like all of our children to be like Frank in this top right-hand quadrant, because Frank can demonstrate good word recognition skills. He can decode, build and blend. He arrives at that accurate reading of the word, and he's reading with a good level of what we call automaticity. But also he's understanding what he is reading. He can talk about the content and he can pass opinion, his thoughts and feelings on that content. So essentially, children need both good word recognition and good language comprehension skills to be a good reader. So it makes sense that when we assess children in terms of their reading, we think about both of these dimensions. Reading is so central to our curriculum. It virtually underpins our curriculum, doesn't it? And we approach reading in many different ways across the school day and indeed across the school week. Therefore, as a team, sometimes we like to think about reading in school as a bit like a jigsaw, made up of many different pieces, all coming together to enrich that child's life as a reader. So you'll see here we've got phonics at the heart, underpinning everything. But then we've got all of these other pieces that all play their role as well. Reading for pleasure. Indeed, that might be the child reading the book to themselves, perhaps curled up on that beanbag in your attractive reading area. They might be completely immersed in that world in which they found themselves. Or it might indeed be that reading for pleasure. Perhaps the teacher is reading a book at the end of the day, or perhaps after lunchtime. Okay. Shared reading, that's the reading that takes place at the start of the reading phase, at the start of those English teaching sequences that we often talk about. And that shared reading is typically pitched just above a level which the children can access independently. And the teacher will be stopping, probing, prompting, having lots of discussion points around that text before it then leads into a piece of writing. We've also got our word lists. Now, some of those word lists might come from your school's chosen phonics programme. And indeed, they also need to be supplemented with your common exception words from the national curriculum. Library time. That library time might be library time in school, or indeed it might be library time outside of school. Perhaps that's something that the parents are contributing to. And that home reading is absolutely key, isn't it? To get those parents on side and for them to really see the value of supporting their children with reading. Guided reading, where children are placed in those groups, but they're all reading that text that's appropriate to their level. And then they can come back together and have that quality discussion centred around that focused skill. Cross-curricular reading, when children are applying those reading skills to those other subject areas. And indeed, reading aloud, whether that be on the playground, whether that be for a performance or perhaps for an assembly, for example. And of course, we also have our summative tests, don't we? Crucially at those end of key stages, but we might also have them perhaps embedded in some of the other year groups at certain points of the year. But each of these pieces, they all play a vital role in supporting our children as readers. And therefore, it makes sense for us to look to some of these jigsaw pieces to help us in our assessment of reading as well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at a few of these pieces of the jigsaw in a bit more detail so that we can think about how they support both formative and summative assessment in reading. Phonics. So because phonics is happening on a daily basis within our early years and Key Stage 1 classrooms, we've got daily formative assessment opportunities happening all the time, whether that be the building and blending of words, phrases, short sentences, or indeed taking part in phonic challenges, perhaps in the practice and apply parts of the phonics session. Crucially, we also need to be thinking about the application of phonics beyond the phonics session. So how is that child applying their phonics knowledge, their building and blending skills, their understanding of that new sound within their guided reading, within one-to-one reading, within cross-curricular reading, etc. Of course, you'll also have in school your summative assessments in line with your chosen SSP programme. So sitting alongside those formative assessment opportunities, that helps you to build a really strong picture. Within the reading framework, it is advocated that schools may choose to provide individual records of pupil progress for phonics. And that presumably is in order to be able to identify very quickly if a child is at risk of falling behind, and then putting those support measures, those intervention programs in place as swiftly as possible. Crucially, we need to remember that attainment in phonics should directly triangulate with that guided reading book and that home reading book in order that children are only encountering sounds within those books that they have been taught. The phrase used by Ofsted is that they closely match. So let's think about guided reading and the significant part that plays in supporting the assessment of our children and their reading. Okay, for children working up to and within phase 5, that's letters and sounds, or indeed equivalent according to your school's chosen phonics programme, the guided reading book should be closely matched to recently taught or focused sounds. For those children, these books need to be 100% decodable, and that's so that the children have the opportunity to apply all of those skills that they've been developing in their phonics to their reading. It also ensures that children aren't encountering sounds and graphemes that they haven't yet been taught. From the end of phase 5 onwards, the guided reading book should then be from the appropriate book band or stage of reading. And typically that might be from around purple onwards. And I say typically to acknowledge that there are, of course, variations within the different publishers. Crucially, this should triangulate with the child's home reading book. So you would expect the child's home reading book and their guided reading book to be from either the same phase or the same book band, focusing on those closely matched sounds if it's the phonic phase. So guided reading is when little groups of children, typically 5 or 6, come together to read a text. And the text is pitched at a level which they can access independently. They might sit together in a group, but they've all got a copy of their own text and they all read it simultaneously, independently at their own pace. Typically, this activity might happen weekly. With some of the younger children, it might happen twice weekly. But it facilitates regular opportunity for formative assessment of both those dimensions of word reading and comprehension. Word reading as the child is reading the text aloud, whether that be that they remain in their place and they simply are reading aloud and you as the adult tune into listening to them, or perhaps with the older children, it might well be that some of that reading is going on silently in their heads. So it's perhaps you physically moving between the group, and when you sit next to that child, they burst into expression wherever they are up to in that text. That's a great way of monitoring that word reading. When the group then come back together, at the end of that reading session, we can then develop that comprehension. And that's where the teacher might be leading that quality discussion centred around that focus skill. Remember, for the older children, they might have been set off on that reading, perhaps with that focus skill in mind, but that comprehension can then be unpicked in that discussion that goes on. Guided reading might well be supported by the use of the lapse grids, and you may indeed already have these in school. You can see here we've got an example of Year 2, Lap 2. We've got the banker statements down the left here. At the top here, we've got all of the admin details, that whether that be the book banding, or the phonic phase, perhaps the group name, date, term, etc. And we insert the pupil names here. Having then selected a focus skill for the context of that session, so for example, discuss and sequence the main events in stories, during that guided reading session, when that skill is being addressed, the teacher can annotate this grid as to how each of these children are coping with that particular skill. So the teacher can tick, they can question mark if that child is unsure, they might want to put a cross if it needs revisiting, they might want to put a date to indicate where that key skill has been addressed. But crucially, that can become a working document. And week upon week, when that's brought out for guided reading, at a glance, we can see the skills that are being covered, who's keeping up with those skills, and where perhaps there are gaps for us to address. Here's an example of one school and how they're using the lapse grids, and you can see very much they've created their own shorthand. They've got their own dates, ticks, crosses, annotations, initials, post-it notes, etc., but they're making that grid work for them, and that's a great way to inform that reading assessment. Moving on to the word list piece of the jigsaw. Word lists for reading and spelling can be found at the back of your key learning in reading, and these are available for all of the year groups. Particularly relevant to Year 1 and Year 2, there is some overlap with the words that are taught through your chosen phonics programme. So you may have seen these Venn diagrams before. These are available on our website, and you'll see that in the left circle of the Venn diagram, we have a collection of high frequency words, in this case, as listed in letters and sounds. In the right-hand circle, we have the common exception words as listed in your national curriculum from 2014. So some of these words may vary depending on your school's chosen SSP programme. However, there's likely to be an awful lot of overlap because they are deemed just high frequency words. What we need to be careful of is that if we are only teaching these words in our phonics sessions, we need to make sure that our Year 1 and Year 2 teachers are aware that there may be some common exception words which don't feature in our phonics programs. So we must make sure that we continue to teach these words and that time is dedicated to the teaching of those words in our English sessions. Now, in terms of assessment, many of these words will naturally appear in the children's reading material where they are read within a context, and hopefully children will be encountering these words on a daily basis. But these particular documents with your Venn diagrams may be useful for some children, perhaps those who need to target specific words and to identify next steps. But crucially, we do need to be aiming to teach them all. Now thinking about shared reading and the role that can play in reading assessment. Shared reading takes place during the reading phase of the teaching sequence. And for those of you who've been on our training before, you'll know that we live, sleep, eat and breathe the English teaching sequence. Okay, and what we're talking about here is when we are teaching whole class English lessons, whether that be a 1-week poetry unit, whether it be a 4-week narrative unit or a 3-week non-fiction unit, we would always advocate that you follow the sequence in order to produce the best quality writing outcomes. Shared text which you use in that reading phase is typically pitched just above that which most children can access independently. And for that reason, the text is shared by, in most instances, the teacher reading aloud to the children. Sometimes the teacher may choose to display sections of the text on the whiteboard, or indeed provide the children with sections of the text or extracts, or indeed hard copies of the book so that they can follow at their desks. But generally they are hearing and being immersed in this text being read aloud by you, the teacher. And that happens over several days, over several lessons, interspersed with all that quality discussion, book talk and targeted questioning around your focus skill. That provides you with an ongoing formative assessment opportunity, going from that discussion, thinking about how well the children in your class are comprehending that text. And remember, every time you start a new unit of work and you plan for that reading phase, you are building in that formative assessment opportunity each time. Assessment in shared reading might be through when you stop to explore new vocabulary. You might be thinking about word meanings, putting those new words in different contexts. You might be stopping to clarify or retrieve key information. You might be turning to a partner, telling your partner what's just happened, or playing just a minute, or saying to your partner, what do you know now? What's happened so far? You might be stopping to predict what's going to happen next. Or perhaps the reverse of that, you might be predicting what's happened previously to that character, perhaps before that event in the story. You might be raising questions that you might have about the text, or questions that you might like to ask a character in role. And crucially, that golden nugget, you might be considering how a character is feeling, thinking about their thoughts, actions, motivations. And look, all of those skills, all littered throughout your key learning in reading, this right hand side, which is focusing on comprehension, express views, retell, sequence, explain, words and phrases, raise questions, explain, make inferences, make predictions, locate information, etc. When the children then return to their places following your input of shared reading, they will be taking on perhaps a reading response activity. And you will notice here that we've got various examples, all learning led. So you can see here to identify key information and to use point and evidence. That's the skill that's been developed, and the activity there that the child's undertaken is true and false. Here, the learning objective is to make inference about character, using again evidence from the text, and the activity is to think about thought and feeling bubbles in relation to certain parts of the story. You can see here again we've got inference about characters and events, and we're placing vocabulary on a zone of relevance chart here. So again, that's another great way to develop vocabulary. And here we've got a dear diary. So it's a diary entry, but the skill being developed is to make inferences around a character. So all of those reading response activities, they are all helping to develop and demonstrate reading skills. And therefore, they also provide us with information about how well a child is mastering that key reading skill. Just a quick mention on that note, we also have this document here, writing opportunities to support the reading phase of the teaching sequence. You may have seen that, and that is available on our website. Of course, central to shared reading, guided reading, and indeed many of those other jigsaw pieces, but particularly to these jigsaw pieces, is discussion. As it says here from the National Curriculum document, comprehension skills develop through pupils' experience of high quality discussion with the teacher, as well as from reading and discussing a range of stories, poems, and non-fiction. Indeed, if you were to count up the number of words pertaining to discussion, how often they feature in the curriculum, you might be surprised to find that they appear over 70 times. No surprise, therefore, that we perhaps see this quote in an Ofsted annual report, that teachers in the most successful schools put talking at the heart of their curriculum. So that discussion is absolutely key. Let's make sure we're not overlooking it. Before I go, just a quick mention about the reading domains. By reading domains, we mean the different areas upon which children are assessed in their reading at the end of the key stage. At key stage 1, we have vocabulary, retrieval of information, sequencing, making inference, and making predictions. At key stage 2, we've got a few more. We've got vocabulary, retrieval of information, summarising, making inference, prediction, thinking about how meaning contributes as a whole, a bit more on vocabulary, and making comparisons within the text. Now, to support your children and indeed to support you in your assessment of children and their reading, we have, of course, our reading domain key rings. And you might be thinking, oh, I've seen those before, or I've seen those in my cupboard, or they're up on my working wall. And they're all colour coded so that they tie in with each of these domains. But what we've done is all of the questions on these cards all use language from the SATS papers so that your children can become very familiar with that SATS style language. So that actually, without us having to ask the children to sit and laboriously do test paper after test paper, we can be dipping into these questions and this SATS style language in guided reading, in shared reading, in one-to-one reading, so that our children are becoming very familiar with the way that the questions are structured and the vocabulary that's used. You might, in using those key rings, want to vary the way you ask your questions and also invite different ways for the children to respond. So sometimes you may ask the question orally and together take some oral responses. Sometimes you might present the question in a written format and again take an oral response. Sometimes you might present the question orally and the children create a written response. However, for them to do that, remember, we have to really model how to structure that written response. And of course, finally, as in the test, presenting the question in written form and then asking the children to produce a written response. Okay. So today I've taken you through some considerations for assessment in phonics, in guided reading and in shared reading. We've also talked about Wordless and the reading domains there. Do keep a lookout for our new reading assessment document, which will hopefully be coming out soon, which will be dipping into all of the other areas of that reading jigsaw. Thanks for joining me. Take care, stay safe. Bye for now.